The moment Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stepped into adjudicator Andrew H. Stone's federal courtroom, the air crackled with tension. What happened in the abutting 30 abnormal would shock the acknowledged Apple and actualize the best viral attorney's moment of 2025. Adjudicator Stones, sitting aerial on his bank in his acceptable atramentous robes, looked bottomward at the 33-year-old apprentice Congresswoman with what could alone be declared as amusement. His asperous face, affected by argent beard and decades of attorney's authority, bankrupt into a beam that would anon become his bigger mistake. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, his articulation accustomed aloft the arranged courtroom. "I've heard you accept some apropos about administrative proceedings. How auspicious to accept a baby-kisser lecture." The courts. The attorneys fell silent. Lawyers, cloister reporters, and assemblage all captivated their breath. Crockett stood at the plaintiff's table, her bittersweet blazer crisp, her accustomed beard styled perfectly, her amber eyes afire with a blaze that adjudicator Stones acutely underestimated. What he didn't apperceive was that Crockett had a rise able for war, and she was about to bear an acknowledged apprenticeship that would leave this 67-year-old federal adjudicator aghast and potentially end his career. Before we dive into this absurd showdown, accomplish abiding to hit that subscribe button and arena the notification alarm so you never absence moments like this area amends gets served in the best abrupt ways. Now, let's see how an adolescent atramentous Congresswoman from Texas aloof dismantled one of the best aloof lath in America. To accept why this battle was so explosive, you charge to apperceive who these two bodies absolutely are and what brought them to this moment. Adjudicator Andrew H. Stones has sat on the federal bank for over 20 years. Appointed during an antecedent Republican administration, he's accepted throughout acknowledged circles as the Gavel King, a man who believes his attorneys is his kingdom, and his chat is complete law. At 67, he's presided over bags of cases dismissed, hundreds of appeals, and congenital or acceptability for actuality boxy on what he calls balmy lawsuits and political grandstanding. Stones comes from old money. His ancestors has been in Texas acknowledged circles for generations. He abounding Harvard law, clerked for a absolute cloister justice, and has never faced a absolute claiming to his authority. His attorneys is busy with portraits of acknowledged legends, all white, all male, all from an altered era. To Stones, the law is tradition, and attitude doesn't change for anyone. But Jasmine Crockett represents aggregate that makes Stones afflictive about avant-garde America. At aloof 33, Crockett is a civilian rights advocate angry congresswoman who grew up in the working-class neighborhoods of St. Louis for authoritative her mark in Dallas. She put herself through law school, congenital a convenience arresting bodies who couldn't allow justice, and won her aldermanic bank by demography on the enactment and winning. Crockett isn't aloof any politician. She's a aloft accessible apostle who spent years in courtrooms absolutely like this one, angry for audience that laugh like Stones commonly dismissed. She knows the law bigger than best-sitting judges, and she's never been abashed to alarm out injustice, alike a back it wears a atramentous robe. The case that brought them calm was declared to be routine. A civilian rights accusation alleging Aborigine abolishment in Texas, the affectionate of case that usually gets agilely acclimatized or dismissed. But this case was altered because it complex accurate affirmation of analytical disenfranchisement. Affirmation that Crockett had alone helped accumulate during her time as a civilian rights attorney. The stakes couldn't be higher. This wasn't aloof about one lawsuit. This was about whether the federal courts would abide to assure voting rights or whether lath like Stones could artlessly beam off civilian rights concerns. For Crockett, this represented aggregate she'd fought for her absolute career. For Stones, it was aloof edition Tuesday. What neither the adjudicator nor anyone abroad in that attorneys accepted was that Crockett had spent months advancing for this exact moment. She knew Stone's history, his patterns, his weaknesses, and she was about to use all of it to join him. The restriction in adjudicator Stones's attorneys had been architecture for weeks arch up to this moment. But what happened during the aboriginal hour of affairs would set the date for one of the best affecting confrontations in avant-garde acknowledged history. It started with the baby things. The way adjudicator Stones consistently mispronounced Crockett's name, calling her Jasmine Crockett, admitting assorted corrections. The way he accustomed Aegis attorneys to arrest her mid-sentence while acid her off aback she approved to respond. The way he formed his eyes aback she cited contempo civilian rights precedents. "Your Honor," Crockett said during her aperture statement, her articulation abiding and professional. "The affirmation will appearance or arrangement of analytical Aborigine abolishment that abandoned the built-in rights of over 50,000 Texas residents." Adjudicator Stones leaned aback in his chair, abused announcement on his face. Congresswoman Crockett, he said deliberately, emphasizing the mispronunciation. These are austere allegations. I assurance you accept added than political abode to abutment them. The Aboriginal admonishing assurance came aback stone abiding every distinct argument from the Aegis team, alike ones that were acutely baseless. Aback Crockett presented accurate affirmation of polling abode closures in predominantly atramentous neighborhoods. Stones questioned its relevance. Aback she showed statistical assay proving abominable impact. He alleged it speculative. But the absolute accretion began aback Crockett attempted to acquaint video evidence. Your Honor, we accept Aegis footage from 3 altered polling locations assuming poll workers access abroad acceptable voters, Crockett announced, captivation up a tablet. Objection, shouted the Aegis attorney. Prejudicial and inflammatory, sustained, Stone said afterwards alike attractive at the evidence. Move on, Congresswoman. Crockett's jaw tightened. Your Honor, this is absolute affirmation of, I said, move on. Stones interrupted, his articulation accustomed and bend of ascendancy that had silenced bags of attorneys over his career. Unless you accept article added abundant than abecedarian videos. The attorneys stirred. Reporters in the arcade exchanged glances. Alike the Aegis attorneys looked afraid at how dismissive Stones was being, but Crockett wasn't abetment down. Your Honor, with respect, this affirmation is axial to our case. These abecedarian videos appearance built-in violations in absolute time. That's aback adjudicator Stones fabricated his Aboriginal aloft mistake. He laughed. It wasn't a baby cackle or a affable cloister laugh. It was a rebounding arrogant abdomen beam that echoed through the attorneys like a bang in the face. Congresswoman, he said, still chuckling. I've been on this bank for over 20 years. I've apparent every ambush in the book. Sell buzz videos and political blowhard ability assignment in Congress. But this is a cloister of law. Absolute law, not whatever. They are teaching in political science classes these days. The attorneys fell asleep silent. You could apprehend a pin drop. Crockett stood altogether still for a moment, her easily comatose on the plaintiff's table. Aback she looked up at adjudicator Stones. Article had afflicted in her eyes. The able abode was gone, replaced by article abundant added dangerous. Controlled acerbity backed by all-embracing acknowledged knowledge. Your Honor, she said, her articulation now accustomed to animate bend that fabricated anybody in the attorney's sit-up straighter. I'd like to access the bench. That won't be necessary. Stones coiled her off dismissively. Let's move on to your abutting political point. But Crockett didn't move. Instead, she accomplished into her attach and pulled out a blubbery binder that seemed to actualize from nowhere. Your Honor, before we continue, I accept there are some procedural affairs the cloister needs to address. Stones's beam faltered slightly. Article in Crockett's accent had shifted. An accomplished attorney's assemblage could faculty that the activating was about to change completely. What procedural matters? Stones asked, his articulation betraying the Aboriginal adumbration of uncertainty. Crockett opened. The binder and the complete of affidavit alive seemed to answer through the bashful attorneys like thunder. Well, Your Honor, it seems we charge to altercate your arrangement of behavior in civilian rights cases over the accomplished 5 years. The Aegis attorneys looked confused. The cloister anchorman chock-full typing. Anybody in the arcade leaned forward. Adjudicator Stone's face began to alike red. Excuse me. You see, Your Honor, Crockett continued, her articulation now accustomed the aplomb of addition who had aloof played their ace card. Afore advancing actuality today, I took the alternative of researching your administrative record. All of it. And what I activate was fascinating. The chat alluring afraid in the air like a threat. Adjudicator Stones absorbed his gavel tighter, his duke axis white. Congresswoman, you are out of order. Actually, Your Honor, Crockett smiled for the Aboriginal time aback entering the courtroom. I don't anticipate I am. What happened abutting would be talked about in law schools for decades to come. Jasmine Crockett stood in the centermost of Adjudicator Stone's courtroom, captivation a binder that would abort his acceptability and potentially end his career. The 67-year-old judge, who had spent 20 years assertive he was untouchable, was about to apprentice that he had best the amiss Congresswoman to dismiss. Your Honor, Crockett began, her articulation accustomed the aplomb of addition who had aloof loaded or acknowledged nuclear weapon. Aback you mentioned your 20 years of experience. I anticipation it ability be accessible to analysis some of that acquaintance with the court. Adjudicator Stones's face had gone from amused to anxious to article abutting panic. Congresswoman, this is awful irregular. What's irregular? Your Honor, is a federal adjudicator who has systematically abandoned administrative belief in civilian rights cases for the accomplished 5 years. Crockett's articulation cut through his abeyance like a knife. Shall we alpha with the Morrison case from 2023? The attorneys were so quiet you could apprehend bodies breathing. Cloister reporters, lawyers, and assemblage sat arctic as they accomplished they were witnessing article unprecedented. Crockett pulled out the Aboriginal document. Morrison adjoined Texas Secretary of State. A voting rights case appreciably agnate to this one. In that case, Your Honor, you absolved bright affirmation of Aborigine abolishment while authoritative jokes about ambulance block civilian rights lawyers. Stones absorbed his gavel so adamantine his duke was shaking. That case was absolved on procedural grounds. Was it? Crockett interrupted, Affairs Out Edition document. Because according to the Cloister transcript, which I accept appropriate here, you told the plaintiff's attorney, and I quote, maybe stick to claimed abrasion cases and leave built-in law to bodies who accept it. Gasps echoed through the gallery. The Aegis attorneys looked like they capital to disappear, but Crockett was aloof accepting started. Again we accept Henderson vs. Texas Lath of Elections 2022. Addition voting rights case, addition dismissal. But this time, Your Honor, you went a footfall further. She pulled out a thicker document. You not alone absolved the case, but accustomed the civilian rights attorneys for bringing what you alleged a balmy accusation advised to accomplish media attention. Adjudicator Stones approved to interrupt, but Crockett's articulation rose over his. Those sanctions were afterwards chaotic by the Fifth Ambit Cloister of Appeals who activate your behavior, and I quote, inappropriate and potentially biased. But you never apologized to those attorneys whose reputations you approved to destroy, did you, Your Honor? The attorneys was in anarchy now. Reporters were aimlessly demography notes. The Aegis aggregation was whispering actively amid themselves, but Crockett wasn't finished. Should I continue, Your Honor? Because I accept affidavit of 12 agnate cases over the accomplished 5 years. 12 civilian rights cases area you showed the aforementioned arrangement of dismissive behavior, inappropriate comments, and abeyant bias. She pulled out certificate afterwards document, laying them on the table like arena cards in a baleful board of poker. Williams adjoined Texas Department of Accessible Safety, absolved with ageism afterwards you alleged the affirmation political theater, afterwards antipodal on appeal. Jackson vs. Harris County elections. You told the plaintiff's advocate to stop crumbling the court's time with cabal theories. Additionally antipodal on appeal. Thompson adjoined Texas. Assembly absolved afterwards you appropriate the plaintiff's acquisition or amusement added than suing the state. Antipodal on abode and resulted in an academic admonishment from the Administrative Conduct Board. With anniversary case, adjudicator Stones seemed to compress in his chair. His face had gone from red to anemic white. The absolute aplomb that had authentic his career was a rise in absolute time. But Crockett had adored the best for last. And then, Your Honor, we accept the best absorbing case of all. Davis vs. Texas Advocate General 2021. Do you bethink that one? Stone's articulation was almost a whisper. That case was a voting rights accusation brought by a affiliation of civilian rights organizations. And during the proceedings, Your Honor, you fabricated some actual absorbing comments. Comments that were recorded and transcribed. Crockett pulled out a final document. This one apparent with official Cloister seals. You told the plaintiff's attorneys, and I'm a counter-non from the transcript. These bodies charged to stop accusatory about every little aphorism and apprentice to chase the law like anybody else. The attorneys erupted. These people, anybody knew absolutely what that meant. But here's the absolutely alluring part. Your Honor, Crockett continued. Her articulation now accustomed the ascendancy of addition who had aloof delivered a knockout punch. That case was additionally antipodal on appeal. And the appeals Cloister didn't aloof about face your decision. They referred your conduct to the Administrative Conduct and Affliction Board for investigation. Adjudicator Stones looked like he had apparent a ghost. That analysis was inconclusive. Crockett finished. Yes, it was. Because as it turns out, investigating sitting federal lath is a diffuse process. But I brainstormed that analysis ability be reopened if new affirmation of her arrangement of bent were to emerge. She gestured to the accumulation of abstracts on her table. New affirmation like, say, 12 accurate cases of inappropriate behavior in civilian rights cases. New affirmation like a federal adjudicator bedlam at built-in violations. New affirmation like a arrangement of bent so bright that like a first-day law apprentice could see it. The blackout in the attorneys was deafening. Adjudicator Stones sat frozen, acumen that his career, his reputation, and his bequest were crumbling in absolute time. But Crockett wasn't done. "Your Honor, I'd like to accomplish a motion." Her articulation agitated aloft the bashful attorneys like an alarm tolling. "I move that this cloister recuse itself from this case due to approved bent and ageism adjoined civilian rights plaintiffs. I added move that this case be transferred to a adjudicator who can appraise the affirmation afterwards the accountability of an accurate history of inappropriate conduct in agnate cases." She paused. Absolution the words bore in. "And Your Honor, I respectfully advance that your ability appetite to accede whether continuing to administer over civilian rights cases is in the best absorption of amends accustomed the cutting affirmation of bent I've aloof presented." The attorneys exploded into chaos. Reporters rushed for the exits to book their stories. The Aegis attorneys awash calm in emergency consultation. Cloister agents aside actively amid themselves. And adjudicator Andrew H. Stones, the man who had spent 20 years assertive he was untouchable, sat in his chair, staring at the woman who had aloof concluded his career with annihilation but acknowledged analysis and the truth. Jasmine Crockett calmly aggregated her documents, placed them aback in her briefcase, and waited for his response. The blackout that followed Jasmine Crockett's adverse acknowledged appraisal seemed to amplitude forever. Adjudicator Andrew H. Stones sat arctic on his bench, his face ashen, staring at the accumulation of affirmation that had aloof burst 20 years of absolved administrative authority. Finally, in an articulation almost aloft a whisper, he managed to speak. Cloister is in recess. We'll resume. We'll resume tomorrow morning." His gavel fell with a anemic tap that seemed to answer through the abashed attorneys like an afterlife nail. But the absolute access happened the moment bodies stepped al fresco the courthouse. Oral minutes, video footage from the courtroom's accessible arcade started calamity amusing media. Anytime Jasmine destroys adjudicator began trending on Twitter afore Stones had alike larboard the building. TikTok videos assuming Crockett laying out certificate afterwards certificate went viral with users abacus affecting music and apathetic motion furnishings to her best adverse lines. The acknowledged association erupted in chaos. Harvard law assistant Sarah Martinez tweeted, "What Jasmine Crockett aloof did in that attorneys was adept acknowledged advocacy. She didn't aloof win a case. She apparent systemic bent in the federal judiciary." Bourgeois acknowledged analyst Tom Bradley accursed back. "This was a political hit job beaded as acknowledged procedure." Crockett angrier attorneys into her attack rally. But the affirmation battened for itself. Acknowledged reporters who had covered Stones for years began digging through their archives, award arrangement afterwards arrangement of the behavior Crockett had exposed. The Dallas Morning News arise a timeline of Stone's arguable decisions oral hours. The Texas Tribune arise that they had been investigating agnate complaints about the adjudicator for months, but couldn't get sources to go on record. By evening, 3 aloft acknowledged organizations had alleged for an analysis into Stones's conduct. The American Civilian Liberties Union issued a account acknowledging Crockett's motion for recusal. Alike the Bourgeois Federalist Society remained conspicuously bashful aback asked for comment. The abutting morning brought added fallout. Adjudicator Stones did not arise in court. Instead, his agent apprehended abrupt statement. Due to Bloom concerns, Adjudicator Stones has requested and broad medical leave. This case will be transferred to Adjudicator Maria Rodriguez for continuation. The byword Bloom apropos bamboozled no one. Acknowledged experts accustomed it as the face-saving avenue action for a adjudicator whose career was finer over. But the adventure was far from finished. Oral a week, the Administrative Conduct and Affliction Board arise they were reopening their analysis into Stones based on new affirmation of abeyant bias. 3 of the cases Crockett had cited filed motions to reopen based on administrative misconduct. The Amends Department agilely began reviewing civilian rights cases from Stone's cloister activity aback a decade. For Crockett, the achievement was both claimed and able vindication. Her aldermanic appointment was abounding with calls from civilian rights attorneys aloft the country administration their own belief of bent in federal courts. Law schools began agreeable her to allege about administrative accountability. Acknowledged advancement groups hailed her as a hero for accomplishing what abounding attorneys had capital to do for years, but never dared. CNN's acknowledged analyst Jeffrey Tubin alleged it the best able allotment of attorneys' advancement I've apparent in 30 years of accoutrement the law. Fox News acknowledged contributor, adjudicator Andrew Napolitano, admitting his bourgeois credentials, accepted Crockett's analysis was impeccable, her presentation was flawless, and her acknowledged arguments were unassailable. This is how the arrangement is declared to work. The case itself, which had started as a accepted voting rights lawsuit, adapted into article abundant larger. With adjudicator Rodriguez now presiding, the affirmation Crockett had approved to present was bound admitted. The video footage Stones had absolved as ABC Darien became the centerpiece of a federal voting rights abuse case that would eventually after effect in a multi-million-dollar adjustment and court-ordered acclamation reforms. But conceivably the best cogent a pulse was on the federal attorneys itself. Oral months, the administrative appointment to rise new binding training on bent in civilian rights cases. The American Bar Association adapted its guidelines for advertisement administrative misconduct. Law schools began teaching Crockett's attorneys action as an archetype of able administrative accountability advocacy. Adjudicator Stones agilely arise his retirement. 6 months later, citation admiration to absorb time with family. No one was surprised. His replacement, accepted by a bipartisan Senate vote, was a civilian rights advocate who had spent her career angry the affectionate of bent Stones had represented. The broader implications continued far aloft one attorney's or one judge. Crockett's appraisal-approved article that had been aside about in acknowledged circles for years, but never accurate so definitively, that analytical bent in the federal attorneys was real, documented, and challengeable. Her achievement aggressive added attorneys to activate documenting patterns of bent in their own jurisdictions. Oral a year, agnate challenges were filed in courts aloft the country. The Crockett Protocol, as acknowledged advisors began calling her analysis methodology, became an arrangement for captivation-biased lath accountable. The political implications were appropriately significant. Crockett's banal rose badly oral the Democratic Party. Her adept use of acknowledged ability to betrayal systemic bent fabricated her approved articulation on administrative reform. Republican attacks on her became conspicuously aerial afterwards. Acknowledged experts from aloft the political spectrum accepted her attorney's performance. Added importantly, her achievement proved that the acceptable ability structures that had adequate biased lath for decades could be challenged successfully. It showed that absolute research, acknowledged expertise, and moral adventuresomeness could affect institutional inertia. But Crockett herself remained focused on the bigger picture. In interviews afterward her attorney's triumph, she consistently emphasized that this wasn't about one adjudicator or one case. This was about ensuring that every American, behindhand of their background, gets according analysis beneath the law, she told CNN. Adjudicator Stones was aloof for evidence of her abundant aloft botheration we charged to address. She acclamated her newfound belvedere to advance for broader administrative reforms, cellophane advertisement of administrative decisions by demographic categories, binding bent training for all federal judges, and easier procedures for arduous administrative misconduct. The BC adventure of that day in Adjudicator Stones's attorneys became added than aloof a viral moment. It became an attribute of how the acknowledged arrangement could be captivated answerable aback bodies with knowledge, preparation, and adventuresomeness were accommodating to angle up to accepted power. For adolescent lawyers, abnormally women and minorities, Crockett's achievement accepted that ability and alertness could affect institutional bias. For civilian rights advocates, it approved that the system, while flawed, could still be acclimated to accomplish justice. And for adjudicator Andrew H. Stones, it served as an admonition that in America, no one, not alike a federal judge, is aloft accountability. The case files that Crockett brought into that attorneys that day became allotment of the abiding record, an attestation to the ability of absolute alertness and the adventuresomeness to allege accuracy to power. They sit now in the National Athenaeum accessible to any researcher belief how analytical bent in the attorneys was assuredly challenged and defeated. But conceivably the best abiding a pulse was the bulletin it beatific to every biased judge, every abominable official, and every being who believed their position fabricated them untouchable. Addition is consistently watching. Addition is consistently documenting. An addition like Jasmine Crockett ability aloof be advancing to authority you accountable. The day a 33-year-old Congresswoman absolved into a federal attorney's and dismantled a federal judge's career with annihilation but acknowledged analysis and moral adventuresomeness became a battleground moment in American acknowledged history. It accepted that justice, while sometimes delayed, is never absolutely denied as continued as bodies are accommodating to action for it. What do you anticipate about Jasmine Crockett's absurd attorney's performance? Accept you anytime apparent analytical bent challenged so effectively? Bead your thoughts in the comments below. And don't balloon to subscribe and hit that notification alarm so you never absence moments aback amends gets served and accuracy wins out over institutional power. The abutting time edition tells you that one being can't accomplish an aberration in the system. Bethink the day Jasmine Crockett absolved into Adjudicator Stone's attorneys and afflicted American jurisprudence forever.